What most people get wrong about an empath is that their breaking point is never sudden. It's not a dramatic outburst or a single moment of collapse. It's a slow, almost invisible buildup, layer by layer, experience by experience, where emotional weight gathers quietly beneath the surface. An empath doesn't respond the way most people expect. When they're hurt, they don't immediately strike back. They analyze, they rationalize, they try to make sense of things. If someone disrespects them, they don't rush to conclusions. They look for context. Maybe that person is going through something difficult. If someone pulls away or turns cold, the empath doesn't reflect that behavior back. They move in closer. Maybe that person needs more support. This is where the whole process starts. Because what appears like patience from the outside is often internal negotiation happening in silence. The empath is constantly balancing what they personally feel with what they believe other people deserve. They override their own emotional signals in favor of keeping the connection alive. And over time, this creates a deeply dangerous pattern. They begin to treat as normal what should have been unacceptable from the very beginning. Every time a boundary is crossed and left unenforced, something subtle changes, not on the outside, but deep within. The empath registers every single one of those moments. They feel each one intensely, but instead of acting on what they feel, they store it away. They tell themselves it's not worth starting a conflict over. They convince themselves that trying to understand is more valuable than reacting. And so they absorb it all. This is the part that most people around them never actually witness, because the empath doesn't always express pain in obvious or visible ways. They don't announce every disappointment out loud. They don't list every betrayal for others to hear. But psychologically, nothing is ever truly dismissed. Everything gets recorded. Every inconsistency, every moment of being undervalued, every instance where their effort went unmatched or unnoticed. And this is where it becomes absolutely essential to understand the difference between endurance and tolerance. Endurance is a conscious choice. It has natural limits. Tolerance, when stretched too far, becomes something else entirely. It becomes self-abandonment. The empath, without fully realizing it, starts crossing that invisible line. They are no longer choosing to stay in a situation. They feel obligated to remain. Not because the situation truly deserves that commitment, but because they have invested so much emotionally that walking away feels impossible. So they give more. They communicate more directly. They grow more patient. They attempt to repair things that were never theirs to fix in the first place. And in doing so, they unintentionally send a very specific message to the people around them. That having access to them carries no real consequence. That their forgiveness is something that can be counted on. That their presence is simply guaranteed no matter what happens. This is precisely how the imbalance takes root and grows. Because while the empath is steadily increasing their effort, the other person often gradually reduces theirs. Not always because of deliberate cruelty, but because of natural human adaptation. Behavior follows patterns of reinforcement. When there is no pushback, no enforced boundary, no experienced loss, behavior does not correct itself on its own. It either escalates or simply grows careless and indifferent. And yet the empath remains, not out of weakness, but because they are wired for depth and genuine connection. They don't connect with others halfway. They don't invest in relationships casually or lightly. When they choose to let someone in, they commit fully, psychologically, emotionally, and often even on a moral level. Leaving doesn't feel like a simple personal choice. It feels like abandoning something they've put their whole heart into. But here is the paradox that sits at the center of all of this. The more they ignore the signals rising up from within them, the louder those very signals become. What once existed as a quiet, low-level discomfort turns into genuine emotional exhaustion. What once felt like patience slowly turns into a deep sense of depletion. And what was once genuine hope gradually transforms into something far more powerful and far more dangerous: clarity. Because eventually the empath arrives at a place where the pattern can no longer be denied or explained away. Not because of one single event, but because of repetition. They begin to see clearly that it was never just a rough day, a misunderstanding, or some temporary rough patch. It was a consistent and repeating dynamic. And once that realization begins to form and take shape, everything they have been holding inside doesn't simply vanish. It organizes itself. It aligns. It suddenly makes complete sense, all at once. This is exactly why their breaking point appears so sudden to everyone watching from the outside. Because while others were only paying attention to what was right in front of them, the empath had been quietly carrying the entire history of everything that came before. So when they finally pull back, when they go silent, when they stop trying to explain or justify or convince, that response is not an overreaction. It is the conclusion of a long process that has been unfolding quietly for a very long time. And by the time anyone else can even see the reaction, the internal decision has already been made and finalized. Because an empath doesn't reach their breaking point when they're simply hurt. They reach it when they come to understand that the hurt was never actually going to stop on its own. And once that understanding settles into place, there is no returning to the version of themselves that existed before that moment. There is a specific point in the empath's journey that shifts everything permanently, but it almost never appears dramatic from the outside perspective. It doesn't arrive with any kind of warning attached to it, and it doesn't always emerge through open conflict or confrontation. In fact, it often takes place in complete silence, during an ordinary day, within an unremarkable interaction, when something deep inside finally locks into place in a way that simply cannot be undone. It's not that the empath suddenly transforms into a completely different person. It's that they finally stop misreading what has been unfolding around them all along. Up until this turning point, the empath has been living inside a kind of quietly held internal assumption that people are fundamentally good at their core, that sincere effort will eventually be matched in return, that if they can just communicate clearly and openly enough, things will gradually improve. This belief system carries enormous power because it grows directly from their nature. They genuinely don't want to see people as expendable. They don't want to reduce meaningful relationships down to simple transactions. So they assign meaning to behavior that, when viewed objectively, doesn't actually deserve it. They reinterpret inconsistency as emotional complexity. They label neglect as stress. They frame emotional withdrawal as something temporary that will pass. And in doing so, they continue to delay a truth that their nervous system has already been quietly registering for a very long time. But the human mind can only hold so much internal contradiction before something finally has to give. You can only carry so many opposing realities at once before something moves toward resolution. And for the empath, that resolution doesn't arrive through heated argument or dramatic confrontation. It arrives through a quiet but profound shift in perception. There comes a moment when they stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking instead, "Why do I keep explaining this to myself?" That single question marks the true beginning of the awakening. Because once an empath starts genuinely observing without immediately jumping to justification, the emotional fog that has surrounded everything begins to lift and clear. Patterns that were once softened by emotion become structurally and clearly visible. The inconsistency is no longer random or accidental. It is consistent and repeating. The imbalance of effort is no longer something that happened by chance. It is something that has been repeated over and over. The emotional confusion they once felt so deeply starts to look less like genuine complexity and more like something else entirely. And this is where the internal fracture truly occurs. Not between themselves and other people, but between their perception and the reality that has been present all along. They start to recognize that they were not simply participating in a relationship as an equal. They were actively managing it from behind the scenes, holding it together through sheer effort, compensating for gaps they never created, filling emotional spaces that someone else had consistently refused to occupy. And the most uncomfortable realization of all is not simply that they were hurt along the way. It is that they were needed far more than they were ever truly valued. That distinction cuts deeply. This is the precise moment when clarity begins to take real form. But clarity, when it first arrives, is not automatically comfortable or empowering. It doesn't feel like strength in those early moments. It feels deeply disorienting, because what clarity actually does is remove the emotional justification that made endurance possible for so long. It strips away the stories they told themselves to stay committed. It dismantles the internal narrative that promised things would eventually improve if they just tried a little harder or gave a little more. And without those stories to lean on, the empath is left holding something completely unfiltered. Raw truth without any emotional cushioning around it. That's why this awakening so often shows up as emotional distance, before it ever looks or feels like personal strength. They begin withdrawing on the inside long before there is any visible withdrawal on the outside. Conversations that once felt genuinely engaging start to feel hollow and repetitive. Effort that once carried real meaning starts to feel entirely one-sided and draining. And most significantly, the emotional urgency they once felt about the relationship or the person begins to quietly disappear. But what is actually happening beneath the surface is not detachment from others. It is a reconnection with their own internal sense of truth. For the very first time, they are no longer reacting to what someone could potentially be or what a relationship might eventually become. They are responding plainly and honestly to what is actually real right now. And reality carries a very different emotional weight than hope does. There is also a subtle but genuinely powerful psychological shift that takes place during this phase. The empath stops investing energy in trying to be understood by people who have repeatedly demonstrated they are not willing to extend that understanding. This is not bitterness settling in. It is something closer to efficiency. Emotional energy no longer flows out in the direction of explanations that circle back to nothing. The deep need to be validated by the very same source that caused the confusion in the first place begins to quietly dissolve and lose its hold. This is the stage where the empath becomes genuinely powerful in a psychological sense, not as a threat to others, but as a quiet force that old and imbalanced dynamics can no longer easily sustain. Because once a person stops over-explaining themselves, stops overextending their generosity, and stops constantly readjusting to accommodate someone else's comfort, the entire structure of the relationship is fundamentally changed. The imbalance can no longer be quietly maintained. The system loses the mechanism that was compensating for everything, and that is when the people around the empath finally begin to feel and notice the difference. They don't always have the language to describe what has shifted. They simply sense it in the air between them. The empath is still physically present in the room, but something essential has stepped back and created a new kind of space. The urgency that once defined the empath's presence is gone. The immediate availability that others had come to rely on is no longer automatic or guaranteed. The emotional openness that was once simply assumed is now something that has to be genuinely earned. But what others experience from the outside as cold distance, the empath experiences from the inside as something long overdue. Alignment. Because for the first time in a long time, they are not being driven by the fear of losing someone. They are being guided by the recognition of what is actually true. And once that recognition becomes something permanent and irreversible, the empath stops arguing their case. They stop trying to convince anyone of anything. They stop attempting to rebuild something that was never being constructed equally from both sides. They simply and clearly see it for what it always was. And that kind of seeing, quiet and complete, is its own form of freedom. And in that seeing, the illusion ends because the awakening of an empath is not the moment they stop caring. It is the moment they finally understand what they were carrying all along and decide they no longer need to carry any of it anymore. And once that realization settles in permanently, the old version of them simply does not come back. When an empath finally detaches, most people around them misread it completely. They assume something has gone wrong somewhere. They think the empath has become cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable in some negative way. But what is actually happening is far more precise than any of that. It is not emotional shutdown, it is emotional reorganization. For a long time, the empath operates in a deeply engaged emotional state. They are tuned in, responsive, and sharply aware of even the most subtle shifts in tone, behavior, and energy around them. They do not just hear what people say, they read what is sitting behind those words. That level of perception creates real depth and genuine connection. But it also creates a serious vulnerability in spaces where that depth is never matched or returned. Because when you are consistently emotionally open inside a one-sided dynamic, something begins to quietly happen on the inside. Your entire system starts overcompensating without you even realizing it. You begin filling in gaps in communication that the other person never bothered to close. You begin anticipating needs that are never once expressed out loud. You begin maintaining emotional continuity for both people in the relationship. And over time, that becomes exhausting in a way that is completely invisible from the outside. What looks like simple caring is actually a sustained and heavy cognitive and emotional load being carried silently. So when the empath finally reaches their limit, the shift that follows is not loud in any way. It is not reactive. It is not emotional chaos or outburst. It is actually the complete opposite of all that. It is silence, but not empty silence. It is structured silence, conscious silence. The kind of silence that comes from a mind that has already processed far more than it is any longer willing to keep expressing out loud. And this is precisely where the people around them become confused, because they were used to a version of the empath who always explained things, who always clarified misunderstandings, who softened tension before it built up, who worked hard to repair things before they could escalate into something worse. That version of the empath was relationally active in every sense. But once true detachment begins, that entire behavioral system simply goes offline. Not because the empath is no longer capable of feeling deeply, but because empathy is no longer being offered without some form of structure in place first. This is a distinction that really matters. Emotional detachment in an empath is not the absence of feeling at all. It is the removal of automatic emotional access. It is a shift from open-loop emotional processing to closed-loop evaluation. In simple terms, they stop reacting in real time to the emotional triggers that used to pull them straight into over-involvement. And when that happens, something very noticeable starts to emerge on the surface: calmness. But it is not the calmness that comes from peace.
It is the calmness that comes from clarity. They are no longer internally negotiating every single interaction. They are no longer translating someone else's confusion into their own patience. They are no longer absorbing emotional inconsistency and quietly trying to stabilize it from within. That work stops completely. And when that internal work stops, their entire external presence shifts in a dramatic way. They become far more deliberate with every word they choose to say. They no longer rush to fill up silence with explanation. They no longer over-explain their own boundaries to people who were never going to respect them anyway.
They no longer feel that old familiar pull to rescue conversations from moments of discomfort. And to those who had grown used to constant emotional engagement from them, this change feels like a real loss. But from the empath's own perspective, it feels like restoration. Because for the very first time, their emotional energy is no longer being spent in real time on managing other people's internal states. It is being redirected inward, into observation, into careful evaluation, into self-regulation that no longer depends on what someone else is or is not doing. And here is what most people completely miss about this stage. Detachment is not withdrawal from connection. It is withdrawal from imbalance. An empath does not stop caring when they reach this point. They stop overcorrecting for the emotional irresponsibility of others. They stop translating inconsistency into hidden potential. They stop confusing intensity with actual intimacy. And once that stops, every relationship that had been quietly depending on their emotional overfunctioning begins to destabilize on its own. That destabilization is what other people feel as distance. But in reality, nothing has been removed that should not have been questioned a long time ago. What has simply changed is that the empath is no longer compensating for emotional gaps that were never theirs to fill in the first place. This is where emotional strength begins to emerge, not through dominance, not through control, but through restraint. Because restraint is something most people cannot actually sustain when they are emotionally activated. They react, they pursue, they explain themselves, they attempt to fix what is happening. The empath, in contrast, learns to observe without immediately responding to what they see. And that delay, that space created between the moment something happens and the moment they choose how to respond, is where real inner power develops over time. In that space, they regain genuine choice. Choice over whether to engage, choice over whether to explain, choice over where emotional investment goes, and most importantly, choice over who gets access to them at all. This is exactly why a detached empath is so often misread by the people around them. Others assume they have simply become indifferent. But indifference does not require awareness of anything. What the empath has developed instead is awareness without compulsion. They still see everything happening around them. They still understand all of it. But they no longer feel obligated to act on every single thing they notice. And that one shift changes the entire psychological dynamic between them and every person in their life. Because emotional access to them is no longer something that is guaranteed to anyone. It now has to be earned through consistency, through real respect, and through genuine reciprocity. And anything that falls short of that simply does not register as something worthy of deeper emotional investment anymore. So what appears on the surface as emotional distance is actually emotional precision. And once an empath arrives at this particular stage, they are no longer being driven by the fear of losing people. They are being guided instead by a clear awareness of exactly what it costs them to keep certain people around. And in that awareness, silence is no longer a reaction to something. It becomes a deliberate decision. And that decision quietly ends every single dynamic that was ever built on emotional imbalance, without a single argument ever needing to take place.
What follows after emotional detachment is often assumed to be the end of the empath's journey. But in reality, it is the very beginning of something far more stable and far more intentional than anything that came before it.
Because once an empath has seen through the patterns, stepped back from the imbalance, and stopped overextending their emotional system in every direction, something important and solid begins to surface underneath all of that accumulated experience. Structure. Not emotional reactivity, not survival-based connection built on anxiety and fear of abandonment, but actual structure.